Ladies and gentlemen, I'm role-playing today, so I don't want the newspapers tomorrow morning to say UMNO youth leader praises the West. This is all fiction. I want to give you hard facts, and start with facts, and facts that don't lie simply because they are statistics. 8 out of the top 10 countries in the WEF Global Competitiveness Report are from the West. 6 out of the 10 in the IMD World Competitive Yearbook for 2010 are from the West. If you look at the competitiveness components within all of these reports on competitiveness, whether it's economic performance, government efficiency, business efficiency, infrastructure, many ASEAN countries rank ahead of the leading lights of the East, China and India, on these subcomponent basis. If we look at enterprises, corporations that drive competitiveness, since the topic is economic competitiveness, 42 out of the top 50 Fortune Global 500 companies are based in the West, making up 82% of the revenue of the top 50 corporations. The coveted brands that we talk about, Apple, Disney, Coca-Cola, they're all Western brands. We covered Mickey Mouse. We don't really like Doraemon. And kids also like Disney and not really the Japanese cartoons, unless you go for a very niche market. Education underpinning competitiveness. Competitiveness is all about education. Just now Dr. Anis mentioned education. It's easier to learn. There are learning practices in the East. But let's look at the rankings of universities. 91 out of the top 100 universities ranked in the Times Higher Education Supplement are in the West. 100% of the top 20 are in the West. 18 out of 20 top business schools ranked by the Financial Times are also in the West. Investments that fuel competitiveness. When you talk about competitiveness, it's all about capital. It's all about money. 6 out of 10 top FDI recipients, even though you talk about China and India today, are in the West. 62% of the recipients of FDI today are still in the West. 7 out of 10 of the top sources of FDI in terms of country, making up 80% of the share of the source of FDI, come from the West. 6 out of 10 top investors in ASEAN alone do not come from Asia, do not come from ASEAN, but come from the West. If you talk about migration, that is indicative of competitiveness. People go to places where they can earn, where they can learn. We're not talking about people moving in droves to the East. In fact, at the end of the 20th century, China replaced Mexico as the biggest sources of migrants to advanced OECD countries. They're not moving to learn from the East. They're moving to learn from where? The greatest country for the recipients of migrants today is still that beacon of the West, the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, those are the hard facts of competitiveness. The West leads by leaps and bounds ahead of the East, whether you're talking about investments, whether you're talking about education, economic competitiveness, and all the other factors that make up competitiveness as we see it. I'm going to move on to ASEAN, how we position ASEAN, since the topic is about ASEAN competitiveness. Let me just say this. ASEAN is a regional bloc. The rest of the East isn't. So when you look at ASEAN as a regional bloc, competitiveness of ASEAN as a regional bloc, where do you look at? Today we heard about how we need to deepen ASEAN integration. We talked this morning about customs harmonization, about spreading around corporate supply chains, expanding currency swap arrangements, basically moving towards freer movement of capital, labor, skilled labor, and ideas. But to do this across national boundaries is not simple. Who has this experience? China? China is one country. India is one country. Japan is one country. Korea is one country. You're talking about a monolith unto itself. But ASEAN isn't. We have national borders. Where do we look to for a regional bloc? The two successful, arguably, regional blocs in the world, the EU, the European Union, with a population of 500 million, similar to ASEAN, 600 million, with a GDP of 15 trillion US dollars. NAFTA, with a population of 450 million, with a GDP of 17 trillion US dollars. Benchmark that against ASEAN, which has a population of 600 million. This whole song and dance and fanfare of ASEAN being together, yet we only have a combined GDP of 1.5 trillion US dollars. Just now, Roger Cook, who runs DHL for Asia Pacific, said to get an example for greater harmonization and integration, ASEAN need not look anywhere other than the European Union and NAFTA. No other example in the East can give that sort of concerted effort to harmonize, to integrate, and to deepen integration, which is what ASEAN needs as far as what we've been talking today. Now, of course, this is not an apple-to-apple comparison. You can say that the European Union is very different from ASEAN because we have the CMLV countries, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam. But we should actually study how regional common markets work, the best practices of a single market, which is the European Union, and how to ensure that even if you have a two-track, the original ASEAN 6 plus the other 4 countries, you can ensure that deepening ASEAN integration is benchmarked against a regional bloc like the European Union or NAFTA. Ladies and gentlemen, the other part of my argument is stage of economic development. Now, it's very easy to say that we want to look to the east. We want to look at countries which have already learned. For example, Dr. Anis mentioned just now, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and even Singapore. But the fundamental fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, although these countries have learned and have become competitive, they learned from the West. They didn't learn from the East, they learned from the West. Modernization came to them, and of course they adapted it. Of course there was contextualization, but the first port of call was from the West. And in this, I'd like to say that many of the core ASEAN countries, whether you're talking about Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, many of us are in more mature stage of development than the shining lights of the East today. When you talk about the East today, you're talking about China, you're talking about India, in addition to the other countries that he mentioned just now. But we're in a more mature stage of development than these countries. So measuring in terms of benchmarking and learning, in terms of economic competitiveness, surely the source is from a region, an economic region, which has a similarly mature stage of economic development, which is not the East, but rather the West. Now, just to give you an example, just to measure economic freedom, which is really measuring the stage of development for each of these countries, the ASEAN 6 are far ahead than China and India, which ranks 139 and 124. If we look at productivity growth in China alone, there's a lot of hype about development in China, about growth in China, about unparalleled growth in China. But if you really look at total factor production in China, it's actually decreased from the 70s to the 90s. Much of the growth coming from investments, not so much from productivity based on education and also based on innovation. The soft issues, just going into it briefly, do we really want to learn from the East where there's problems of environmental degradation, there are problems of censorship, there are problems of not liberating the democracy, liberating their people to have free choices in a democratic space? And last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, since I'm limited by time to 20 seconds, learning does not mean just learning the best practices of the West. If you are all here today and you've all voted to say that we'd rather learn from the East because we can't learn from the West because they've made so many mistakes, when we learn from people, we also learn from their mistakes. And I would argue that the West has made categorically more mistakes than the West, than the East. And surely it's much, much more easy to learn from people who've made much, much more mistakes than us. Thank you very much.